Did we learn anything about Aryna Sabalenka from the Battle of the Sexes? The original Battle of the Sexes wasn't necessarily hugely informative from a sporting perspective. Bobby Riggs was in his mid-50s and 30 years removed from his sporting prime, but it had huge symbolic significance. Riggs had been venomous in his dismissal of the women's game and was humbled by Billie Jean King, with her victory doing much for the reputation of what was then a fledgling women's tour that would go on to become the WTA Tour. When Aryna Sabalenka took on Nick Kyrgios, their match was played out in very different circumstances. Rather than being a nascent organization, the WTA Tour represents probably the most high-profile women's sport in the world, with its athletes having, belatedly, achieved equal pay with the male counterparts at the sport's mixed events. Sabalenka herself earned over $15 million in prize money alone last season and has career earnings north of $45 million. Her financial earnings matter because it illustrates the financial strength and raised profile of the women's game, which hardly needed this exhibition to find a new audience. That also enabled Sabalenka and Kyrgios to play just for pride, but it's not entirely clear whether Sabalenka's pride will have been burnished by the events in Abu Dhabi. She was beaten, which was probably inevitable. The loss of her first serve may or may not have helped her cause, but Kyrgios' advantage in power and speed was never likely to be surmountable for Sabalenka. One suspects that the difference in court size, with Sabalenka's side 9% smaller, was likely no more than a distraction and certainly seemed to have little impact on Kyrgios. Indeed, the Australian seemed to be playing within himself for much of the match, which is again hardly a surprise given he's barely played a competitive match over the last 2 years. So what did Sabalenka actually get out of the match? She may have appeared in a few more headlines than is usual during the off-season, but as the world number one she already has a huge international profile, and it would be a major surprise to learn that this match had meaningfully moved the dial in that respect. That leaves only the competitive element, and it again seems unlikely that Sabalenka gained much from the exercise in that respect. For a host of reasons, her match against Kyrgios will not have much in common with any of her assignments over the coming year. It may even have distracted from her preparations for the 2026 season, and at the very least, one suspects she would have been better served by playing in more similar conditions to those she will face at the Australian Open. That's not to say that this Battle of the Sexes will have undermined her hopes of winning another Australian Open. But it does reflect the fact that both from a symbolic and a sporting perspective, there was no real value to the match in Abu Dhabi. Main photo credit, Aaron Dostler. Main images. The phrase Battle of the Sexes arrives already carrying history on its back. It echoes with Billie Jean King's calm defiance, Bobby Riggs' bravado, and the cultural noise of an era when a tennis match pretended to be a referendum on gender itself. So when the phrase is borrowed again in the modern game, especially in connection with a player as magnetic and misunderstood as Aryna Sabalenka, it does more than describe an exhibition or a hypothetical matchup. It invites projection. It asks us to believe we are about to learn something essential. But did we? If the goal was to learn whether Aryna Sabalenka is strong enough, the answer was already obvious long before any such battle was imagined. Strength has never been her question. If the goal was to measure her tennis against a male benchmark, then the lesson says more about our lingering need for comparisons than about her game. And if the goal was to understand Sabalenka herself, her mindset, her growth, her place in the sport, then the learning happens not in the scoreline, but in the way she occupies the court, the narrative, and the moment. Aryna Sabalenka has always been loud tennis. Her strokes crack like thunder. Her grunt, criticized, parroted, weaponized, announces intent before the ball even clears the net. Watching her play can feel like standing too close to a speaker at a concert, overwhelming, thrilling, sometimes uncomfortable. For years, that volume led people to flatten her into a single idea: power without control, force without finesse. A player who either overwhelms or implodes. The Battle of the Sexes framing tries to flatten her again, just in a different direction. It reduces her to a data point in an argument she didn't start: how women's tennis compares to men's. In that sense, the first thing we learn, ironically, is how little some audiences have learned at all. The question itself is outdated. Tennis is not one ladder with men at the top and women climbing upward. It is two ecosystems, built differently, demanding different skills, producing different kinds of excellence. Sabalenka's excellence lives in her contradictions. She is one of the most physically imposing players on the women's tour, yet her career arc has been defined less by muscles than by mind. Double faults once haunted her like a recurring dream. Matches slipped away not because her opponent out-hit her, but because her own game turned against itself. Watching Sabalenka lose in those years felt like watching someone argue with their reflection, every mistake escalating the next. What we learned over time is that power is only dangerous when it is trusted. Sabalenka had to learn to trust herself not to swing harder, but to swing quieter. That kind of learning doesn't show up in a battle. It shows up in restraint, in choosing margin over massacre, patience over panic. So if a battle of the sexes teaches us anything real about Sabalenka, it's not about speed or strength. It's about context. Put her in a spectacle designed to provoke comparison, and she doesn't shrink. She doesn't apologize. She doesn't play smaller. That, perhaps, is the point. Sabalenka has never tried to be likable in the traditional sense. She smiles, yes. She jokes, yes. But she does not soften her edges to fit an expectation of femininity that asks female athletes to be grateful, graceful, and quiet. In a culture that still occasionally frames women's sports as a variation rather than a main event, that refusal matters. The battle of the sexes invites the old question: what happens if you take a top woman and place her against a man? But Sabalenka's career has been about a different question entirely. What happens when a woman stops asking permission to be dominant? The answer has been Grand Slam titles, world #1 conversations, and a presence that alters matches before the first ball is struck. Opponents feel her across the net. Crowds feel her in the stands. The tour feels her in the way younger players now arrive believing that raw aggression is not only allowed, but sustainable.